Welcome, everybody. So we are in Philippians. This is our third lesson, and we are in chapter 1, the last half of chapter 1. And someone remind us or give us some thoughts about what you remember from last week's lesson. If you didn't get to be here, I shared a recording. I'm not the most professional at the recording. I'm working on it, but I tried.
It was great. It was good.
So some thoughts about what we said last week?
All I can remember is your amazing art analogy, and and I've actually shared it with like 3 or 4 people this week because it just struck me because it spoke to me.
What was the art
We can
analogy?
tell who art spoke to. Do you remember what it was, Julie?
Yeah. So when in the part in Philippians, when Paul is speaking, he actually breaks into prayer. He starts out and he wishes that they would have the love, and then from love, it's leading into knowledge and insight and discernment and single-mindedness. And so the thought was, how is it that love leads into these things? And it was because just like in art, the main thing that we have to learn is how to see properly before we can draw a subject. In this case, we have to love in order to kind of see like God's seen. And once we're loving, it opens up our eyes to see things from God's perspective, which then gives us knowledge and discernment and insight and single-mindedness and all of that stuff. So
Wow, nicely said. I like that.
it spoke to me.
Yeah. I wished Meg was on last week. She let me know she wasn't going to be here tonight, but I had forgotten at the moment that she is an artist. Like that's her profession and her degree. And so I should have gotten Meg's perspective on that too. Next time, maybe. Yeah. And then we talked about that prayer a lot, when Paul burst into that prayer and what he prayed for people and how, what a beautiful blessing it was and how much he called on God to give them. And then we also talked about some themes that we saw in the chapter as a whole and in his introductory Thanksgiving. So does anyone remember some themes? Hi, Laura Kate. Hi, Allison. Good to see you guys. So,
Hey.
Erin, talk, but unmute yourself.
Oh, I clicked on my picture instead of muting myself. I mean, I said, you mean like that beautiful picture was it Laura Kate that drew that on your Instagram of the economic and the religious and the socioeconomic different stances and the gender and the pulling together of the different.
Those were the notes from the Acts lesson that we did first, but some of those same things came up, right? The idea of the relationship between people that wouldn't have normally had relationship and the idea of unity. Yeah, so we had a theme of prayer. Remember, Paul not only bursts into prayer at the end, but the beginning, he talks about praying and thanking God for them. And we had the theme of the love and the relationship that he had with one another. So, to your point, Erin, and to Laura Kate's cool drawing. And then this idea of maturity, to bringing them to completion and that God would complete the work in them and their opportunity to grow into Christ. Right. Okay, so that was kind of last week. So let's start this week. We're going to begin by reading verses 12 through 18. So if someone would just pick that up and read it, that would be super.
I'll read it.
Great. Thanks, Paige.
Now, I want you to know, brothers and sisters, that what has happened to me has actually served to advance the gospel. As a result, it has become clear throughout the whole palace guard and to everyone else that I am in chains for Christ. And because of my chains, most of my brothers and sisters have become confident in the Lord and dare all the more to proclaim the gospel without fear. It is true that some preach Christ out of envy and rivalry, but others of goodwill. The latter do so out of love, knowing that I am put here for the defense of the gospel. The former preach Christ out of selfish ambition, not sincerely, supposing they stir up trouble for me while I'm in chains. But what does it matter? The important thing is that in every way, whether for false motives or true, Christ is preached, and because of this I rejoice. Yes, and I will continue to rejoice.
Thank you. Okay, so what is Paul's overall purpose in this section?
I think he's trying to quiet the fears of his friends.
Okay.
And trying to show them that, God is in this and he's got me. So it's going to further his kingdom.
Yeah. What were you going to say, Erin?
I was going to say, you kind of is a don't feel sorry for me type attitude.
Yeah, there's a sense of reassurance here, right? Mm-hmm. And why do they need reassuring? What's going on with Paul?
He's in prison now, right?
Yeah. And what do we think he might have been in prison? Like, what might the charges have been? What's this about? Why would he be in prison?
For preaching the gospel?
Yeah, his message was subversive in a lot of ways, right? And he ran into trouble because of the message of the gospel. Right? Over and over, people find in what he's preaching that it is disruptive or challenging or threatening enough that they oppose him to the point of these, legal charges, right? So there are two possible places he might have been imprisoned when he wrote this. I can't remember how much we talked about this last week. Does anyone else remember? Did we talk about it? Okay. Super, then we'll talk about it. Okay, so two possible places he might be in prison. Guesses as to what one might be?
Rome?
Yeah, Rome is one of the possible places. So if he's in Rome, then that means this is at the end of his ministry and what will turn out to be the end of his life. He was in prison in Rome starting about 60 AD. And we think that he died around 64 AD. So for some time, the dominant thinking, hi Danielle, welcome. The dominant thinking was that he would have been imprisoned there because, any ideas? There's a mention of a word in here that has tipped people off. Does anyone notice? It's obscured in some translations, but verse 13
is that like that imperial guard?
Is the imperial guard. Some translations will just say palace guard, and some will say praetorian. Praetorian is the most literal there. It's an imperial guard. This was it's the emperors. It's the division of the guard that guards the emperor Caesar. But what we know now, so for a while it was like, well, he mentions the imperial guard, he must be in Rome where the emperor is. However, we now know that there were divisions of that organization in all the major Roman outposts. And so now there's a thinking, well, that doesn't guarantee that it was in Rome. So one possibility, Rome, and if so, the Jews initially made the charge against Paul in Jerusalem, and he goes through a series of trials. He eventually appears to Caesar, he's shipwrecked, he finally makes it to Rome. This whole journey, and he would have been writing the Philippians back from those times. The other possibility is that he is imprisoned in Ephesus between 55 or 56 AD. So if so, it was substantially earlier, and this would have been a time where he was still going to be released and would still get to visit the Philippians again. And the reason we think it might have been Ephesus is because we know something really bad happened when Paul was in Ephesus in the middle of his third missionary journey. And when Luke tells this story in Acts 19, he tells some stuff that happened, but he does not tell of an extended prison stay. Well, we know that Luke he had to pick and choose, right? He couldn't include everything that happened. Any historian has to curate their material. They have to decide what needs to be included for the purposes of their whole story, right? Well, Luke doesn't say there was an extended prison stay, but when Paul writes the Corinthians about this time, he says that this was a time that we despaired even in life, and we felt we were under a sentence of death. And so he has all this emotion, and he was clearly discouraged and suffering some great hardship. And there's just nothing in there. We go like, well, none of this fits the great hardship that Paul said he was experiencing there. So we know that more happened there. We think it may have been an imprisonment, and we think that Paul might have written this letter from Ephesus. In which case, you know, when he says later, I know I will continue so that I can more fruitful labor for you, then that did indeed happen. So 2 possibilities there. Questions or comments on that?
Yeah, I got confused in there when you said that the part when he was writing to the Corinthians that he despaired at life, was that the Ephesus imprisonment or the Roman imprisonment?
We don't know what he was writing about, but that was before Rome. That was when he was writing. So that's in 2 Corinthians 1, 8 through 11, if you want to look it up later, you make a note or whatever. And we don't know exactly what he was referring to, but it's thought that because of the timing of that letter and the way the back and forth goes, that it was something that happened in Ephesus. Some scholars have thought it might have been a severe illness, but an imprisonment seems to fit better with the things that
so we don't know for sure that he was imprisoned in Ephesus.
Well, we get a story of a brief,
something,
you know, he has some skirmishes there, some stuff, but there's something longer that happens there from the way that he talks about it. It's kind of a puzzle to try to fit the Acts story in with everything Paul says in his letters, which, you know, makes sense when we see biographies, right? Like, do I have no light all of a sudden? My light did not change in my house. I don't know. When we read biographies and we see people try and put together the events of someone's life from a series of letters and a series of events in newspapers, like it's always a puzzle to put it together. So it makes sense that it's a puzzle for Paul, but yeah. I think the Ephesus date and location fits better, but it's speculation. Okay, so when Paul is reassuring them, he says that this is really okay. Why does he say it's okay that he's in chains?
Because the rest of the Imperial Guard is learning about him, and then it's giving other people confidence, and
or others are speaking instead of him. Like it's opened up for others to speak, because it says, because of my chains, most of the brothers in the Lord have been encouraged to speak the word of God more courageously and fearlessly. Is that what you're?
Okay, so we have the encouragement for the brothers to speak. We have the Praetorian Guard, or the Palace Guard, the Imperial Guard has learned about the gospel. And then one more thing. And this is it's a good thing, but it's also the other half of Paul's problem, right? What's the other half of Paul's problem?
Is it the false motives, like those who are preaching?
Right. There seems to be a group.
The rivalry, envy and rivalry.
Envy and rivalry. Okay, there seems to be a group that is also preaching the gospel. Now, are they telling the truth about the gospel, or is there something false in what they're saying?
So that today people in true gospel, but preaching it for power for themselves or for different motives.
Right. So he doesn't seem to have a problem with what they're saying, right? They seem to be saying the truth, but they're saying it out of bad motives. And what does Paul say about their bad motives? You know, he says envy, rivalry are their actual motives, but
it doesn't matter.
Say that again, you broke up.
She said, it doesn't matter. They're preaching the gospel. The word's getting out there.
Right. And isn't this kind of strange, right? That he's saying their motives don't matter. So in what way do they not matter? And then, you know, in what way do we know that they matter to something, right? What do they not matter to?
They don't matter to him.
Yeah. And might they actually make his life worse? Like there seems to be a real possibility that they think they can stir up trouble for him, because they can indeed stir up trouble for him. They might be able to make his life worse. He is not worried about that, is he? What else is he not worried about?
Them stirring up trouble. The former preach out of selfish ambition, but not sincerity. Supposedly they can stir up trouble for me while I'm in chains, but it doesn't matter.
Yeah, yeah.
Does
it doesn't matter. Go ahead.
Does it seem like he also doesn't really think that they're preaching out of false motives is going to lead people astray?
Yeah, he seems to think that it does not matter. Their motives are not going to keep people from really hearing the truth. So it's interesting to think about, you know, because they're speaking the truth, he trusts that God can use this truth spoken even from impure motives, right?
So my study Bible has a good sense in the explanation. The message is more important than the medium. Okay. Meaning just the message gets out. It's more important than however it was put out. So
it's a very interesting idea, right? Because sometimes I don't know about you, I can get hung up on if I don't think people have good motives on maybe what they're doing not being okay with me, right? If they're not doing it from right motives, then maybe it's not good. But Paul seems to think God can use it just as well, right? And then what about for those people and their heart and their growth? Would Paul say their motives don't matter for that?
No, I think their motives matter quite a bit for that.
Yeah. I don't think that's what he's speaking to here. He's not saying like motives never matter, whatever you do, it doesn't matter what's in your heart. He's not saying that. He recognizes that envy and rivalry are poor motives, right? But he just says God can still use that. Other questions or comments about this section? Let's start in 18 B. If your translations vary where they break that paragraph, but start in 18, the last half of 18, and then read to 26, please. So take that.
I can do that.
Right.
Yes, I will rejoice, for I know that through your prayers of Spirit of Jesus Christ, this will turn out for my deliverance, as is my eager expectation and hope that I will not be at all ashamed, but that with full courage now, as always, Christ will be honored in my body, whether it by life or by death. For to me to live is Christ, and to die is gain. If I am in the flesh, that means fruitful labor for me. Yet which I shall choose, I cannot tell. I am hard pressed between the two. My desire is to depart and be with Christ, for that is far better. But to remain in the flesh is more necessary in your account. Did you say 24?
26.
Convinced of this, I know that I will remain and continue with you all for your progress and joy in the faith, so that in me you may have ample cause to glory in Christ Jesus because of my coming to you again. Only let your manner of life be worthy of the gospel of Christ, so that whether I come and see you or am absent, I may hear of you that you are standing firm in one spirit with one mind, striving side by side for the faith of the gospel, and not frightened in anything by their opponents. This is a clear sign to them of their destruction, but of your salvation. And that, sorry, my dog's barking at me. It's making me really distracted.
Go ahead, just finish the chapter because we already started that section.
Okay. For it has been granted to you that for the sake of Christ you should not only believe in him, but also suffer for his sake, engaged in the same conflict that you saw I had and now hear that I still have.
Okay. So we read 2 sections there, and that's
sorry about that.
Great. No problem.
Blame it on my dog.
I like your dog. Okay. So, looking at, we'll focus first on that last part of 18 through 26. What do you notice in here? What stands out to you?
Well, this is the often quoted, for to me to live is Christ and to die is gain. Like, he's fine. He sees that as being his salvation, and he can move on, but he knows that he may still have, like, if he remains, he has work.
Yeah.
I will continue to be with all of you in your progress. So
yeah, and there from that portion of the passage, we sort of pull out some pieces about what it means to die for someone who is in Christ, right? Because we can tell from Paul, what is Paul's general attitude about death for himself?
That he'd rather that because he could be with Christ.
To be with Christ. Yeah, there is a goal before him that he says is a very good thing, right? So some things we can see about death here, we see in verse 21, to die is gain, that there's some good there. And then verse 23, he says, depart and be with Christ. And so, even if we don't know everything there is to know about what happens after death, right? And there's some part of that that's a mystery. We know that we are with Christ. That's what he says he will get to be, is with Christ. And that happens as opposed to remaining in the body, right? So there's the life in the flesh and remaining in the body. And then just to give you a preview of our coming lessons, we're going to talk about what it means to have the body of the resurrection, right? Because here he says he's out of the body and he's with Christ. And then later he'll talk about how the body is transformed. Our lowly bodies are transformed to be like his glorious body. And that's that he puts that at the point of the complete resurrection. So we think from this, and when we put all those pieces together, that there is a time out of the body where we're just with Christ before the final resurrection. A very interesting point. And, even if we don't understand it, that the joy that Paul has in that is significant, right? Look where joy comes up in this passage. Where do you see it?
joy and faith. That's what my translation has.
Where?
Joy and faith in the end of 25.
Oh, yes. Yeah.
So that
your
through my being so that through my being with you again, your joy in Christ. So joy in faith and joy in Christ.
Yeah. It's twice that he says the word joy. And we see in that, with that theme of maturity and completion that we talked about from last week shows up there, right? So your progress in the faith, they are maturing into a point of joy in Christ Jesus. And overflowing joy. So that deep sense of joy ends this passage. And then look at the beginning. Look at verse 18.
Starts out there with yes, and I will rejoice.
Yeah, verse 18. Either way, Christ is proclaimed, and in this I rejoice. Yes, and I will rejoice. So he says joy twice in the beginning and twice in the end. And this whole section of life or death is really just encapsulated by that idea of the joy set before him. Yeah. Okay, what's something else interesting about this section? Why is he willing? He doesn't want to die in the sense of not having a will to live, right? Mm-hmm. That doesn't fit here. That's not what's going on. It's not that he doesn't value life. It's just that he has such a strong sense of Christ. Why is he willing to go on living with them?
Because if he remains living, that means he has more work to do.
Yeah, work that will benefit whom?
Christ Jesus.
Yes, and
the people he's writing to.
Yeah, these people, right? He has such a love for them that even though his love for Christ is so real and present to him, that he wants to keep blessing them, keep sharing the truth, keep helping them mature, right? Okay, anything else stand out to you? Look at this this part. Let's see, where is it? What verse? Verse 20. He says, I will not be put to shame. What does he mean by that? Why would he be put to shame? What's shaming going on here?
Well, I mean, generally, if you're in prison, you did something wrong, and he didn't. And so he's not ashamed to be in prison.
Right. So this idea of the reputation and the loss of honor would have been very pronounced for being put in prison, right? And we have to remember this is sometimes in contemporary analysis, this is called an honor shame culture. Western culture tends to be like guilty or not guilty is sort of the way that Westerners think about you being right or wrong. But an Eastern understanding, and in these ancient cultures, this is what Paul was in, is an honor shame culture where honor is the most important. Your reputation is your most important asset. And an event like this could be devastating to your reputation. Honor in an honor shame culture is a shared commodity. And so experiencing a shame or a loss of honor reflects on your personal community. So it would reflect on your family or on your in present day, like on your business, or in Paul's case, in the community that he has founded and encouraged, the church. And so a loss of honor really pulls down, or could be seen to pull down, the whole community of the church, right? But he says, even though his imprisonment would normally be considered a source of shame, in the true view of reality, in God's view of reality, he says he's not shamed by this. Exactly what Paige said. He says he didn't do anything wrong, and so therefore it's flipped, right? He's in a paradox. He's in this sort of upside down world where suffering is a source of honor, and where bearing shame for Jesus is something that he will later say he can boast in, right? He says everything is backwards. And that's why he says what happened will turn out for my deliverance. Do you see that in verse 19? That word for deliverance is the same word for salvation. So we've talked about that word, how it showed up with the slave girl. These men are showing you the way to salvation. We talked about the jailer saying, tell me how I can be saved. That idea that what Caesar offers is salvation. And Paul is saying salvation is found in Jesus Christ. And he says, this will turn out for my salvation. And so it's this complete reversal of the way he's viewing reality. He says, because it's all about Christ, that's what defines it, whether he will be put to shame. You notice in, let me see, 19, he says, 13, he says, for the whole palace guard and to everyone else that I am in chains, and it probably says for Christ, but literally it's in Christ. And so he is in chains in Christ. His whole identity is based in Jesus. And because of that, he will not be put to shame. And they are not put to shame, right? They can live in Jesus knowing that their view of reality is based in him and not in anything else. Yeah. Any other comments or questions on this section? Well, let's look at 27 through 30. So Julie read that, and it starts out, whatever happens, you may have conduct yourselves. Does anyone have something different? Everyone, it's conduct yourselves?
Let the manner of your life be worthy of the gospel.
Okay, the manner of your life.
Yeah, my notes say stand firm in the one spirit, striving together as one for the faith.
Okay, yeah, that in 27 and 28, he has quite a bit of content about that. This conduct yourselves is literally conduct your citizenship or exercise your citizenship in a manner worthy of the gospel. Now, why would he be mentioning citizenship?
Because he is a Roman citizen and not just a person in prison, and they need to step into their citizenship role and leave that way. I don't know.
Yeah, he's a Roman citizen. What about Philippi? What's one of their big sources of pride in Philippi?
They were the Roman colony, so they were all citizens, right?
And the military retires there.
Yeah, so these would have, I mean, not everyone would be citizens, of course, but you've got it, right? That's a point of pride there, that they're a Roman colony and that their citizenship is in Rome, right? And so later he's going to talk to them about their citizenship being in heaven. And so here he says that you conduct or exercise your citizenship in a manner worthy of Rome. What is it worthy of?
The gospel of Christ.
Right. I think we can relate to this, right? Where is our citizenship? Where is our pride in our citizenship, right? You know, we have a national citizenship. We have a citizenship in our city. Wherever we are, we have a pride and a sense of belonging and a sense of responsibility about that citizenship. And Paul is beginning to tell them that their primary citizenship, that primary allegiance, is to the gospel, the good news that Jesus Christ reigns, right? And so there may be a conflict there sometimes, right? Who reigns, Jesus or Caesar? Who reigns, in my life, my allegiance to my country or my allegiance to God, and so in that there's a sense of like, what's primary, what's important, where, and how do I conduct myself in a way that my citizenship in the gospel is the most important thing? Thoughts on that?
That's funny. That's something that we've had to discuss with our kids a lot in the last year, because the government may toe one line, and those are the laws, but as a Christian and a human, in a lot of cases, there are other things that you need to do that don't always uphold the law in the strict way the law.
Yeah, and a lot of times we just need to do much more than the law requires, right? Like the law may allow me to exercise my rights in these ways. You know, I have freedom of speech. I can say what I want, but does my citizenship in the gospel allow me to say what I want? Do I really want to exercise those rights, or do I want to do something different? Other thoughts on that? What does Paul want to hear about them? He says, so whether I come and see you or only hear about you, right, I will know that what are the things he wants to hear about them?
He wants unity. He wants to hear about unity from them.
Right? Yeah. He wants them to stand for, what are the points of unity that you see in this? Kind of looking through 27 and 28.
Stand firm and don't be frightened.
Okay, so that's a sort of a little bracket around this, right? There's a sense of strength and fortitude, maturity there for them to stand firm and to not be frightened. What are they supposed to stand firm to do? Give me the phrases that are in the middle there.
So mine says standing firm in one spirit, with one mind, striving side by side for the faith of the gospel. So it makes me think of like spiritual and then mental and then physical, and not frightened in anything by your opponents.
Yeah, so that idea of standing firm in one spirit, contending as one man, like side by side. Yeah, I had to mute there just for a second. This idea that they would be unified together, we have to remember, would that have been easy for them?
No.
No, you know, it's not easy for us. And sometimes we think, yeah, but we're like a melting pot, so it's harder. What about them? What would have made this hard for them?
Would they have been a mix of Jews and Gentiles at this point, or mostly just Gentiles?
They may have been mostly Gentiles, since they were mostly Gentiles to start with. But yeah, we know later that there had to have been some Jews, because they have some Jewish philosophy that Paul speaks against in a later chapter. So Jews and Gentiles, right? There's a racial divide there. It's probably not the only racial divide in the ancient world, right? The Romans had conquered a lot of people, and they had peoples from all over. And that was a kind of melting pot, like we might be familiar with. And so racial divides would have been huge there. What else? What else besides race?
Socioeconomics.
Yeah, remember we talked about how there was a big part of the population that lived at a subsistence level, and a substantial part that was sold into slavery to pay debts. And so even though slavery was not the institution from American history, not that kind of slavery, but there's still, you know, these people were owned, right? This was a brutal institution. And so there were slaves, there were the poor, and then the wealthy tended to be very wealthy. And so that divide between the haves and the have-nots would, of course, be just as divisive as we've ever seen it be, right? So that idea of the unity that they would need to live under would have been extremely challenging. And yet he says, this is the thing I want to hear from you, that you're standing firm and not being afraid to be unified. That's tough. It's abstract in some ways, but when you actually start doing it, it starts getting very real, very difficult, right? So other questions or comments on that? What's the other? Go ahead, Julie.
Oh, I'm keep backing up and thinking about the Roman citizenship versus the citizenship in Christ, and how Lynn's been working on some citizenship merit badges things during the day. And so we would keep talking about citizenship. And it's interesting how it talks about duties and obligations, but also about rights and like privileges. And it's interesting to me because I think contrasting those two, your citizenship in Rome as a Roman citizen, it gave you a lot of rights and privileges. But being a citizen of Christ, a follower of Christ, doesn't seem like it gives us that same types of rights and privileges, right? We're called to lay down our rights, and we're called to, like, we have the privilege of knowing Christ, and we have the privilege of having that relationship with Christ. But it, that to me, that underscores the idea of how we get to unity, and how we can move there.
Yeah, that's very well said. There's a sense of the privilege of joy that he points out to them, that progress into maturity, and that their joy may overflow and their love may abound, and they may have wisdom and depth of insight. He calls that all out for them as something, not a right, but as a gift, right? And so the idea of they have all these maybe privileges, or maybe we say gifts in the gospel, but all of them come from laying down their rights, right? And so that leads exactly into what I was going to point out, like in verse 30, what is the other sign of their citizenship? 29:30.
Suffering?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Suffering like whom?
Christ.
Yeah, and
Paul.
Paul, right? So are they imprisoned as Paul is?
Not yet.
No, and yet he compares their suffering, right? He says, you're participating in suffering just as I'm participating in suffering, both of them suffering on behalf of Christ, right? So that idea that they are living under the reign of Christ in the kingdom, and we have to remember that word Christ is the Greek for the Hebrew Messiah, the anointed king. So whenever we say like Jesus Christ, Jesus the King, Jesus the new ruler of the kingdom of God that he has brought, living in the kingdom of God is living under the reign of God. And so they follow different rules, and they're going to suffer for it. And when we consider this whole section, we see that he's bringing out and bringing together all of these things that are happening, right? The bad things that are happening to him is how he starts, and he comes back around to the suffering that they are experiencing and dealing with, and that idea, like, does he think these things are right? That he's in prison? Is that good or right? Someone spoke up, but I couldn't tell who it broke. So say it again.
I think he doesn't think it's right, but if it glorifies God, he doesn't care.
Yeah. It's interesting because sometimes when we are trying to deal with a situation of suffering, we try to make it seem like it's really okay that it's happening. And I don't think Paul does that. I don't think he minimizes it or says it's good or right. He talks about himself suffering and being in chains in a very realistic way. And he talks about their suffering in a realistic way. He's not minimizing it, but he is saying that he approaches it with confidence. Where do you think his confidence comes from? What is he confident of?
The end.
His salvation.
Yeah. So he says, I'm confident that this will turn out for my salvation. He may not. It's clear he doesn't mean I won't die, because he says I might die, right? I could. He acknowledges that's a real possibility, but he's still confident of his salvation in terms of his being with Christ. So that there's one confidence. What else?
When verse 25, this is, and having this confidence, I know that I shall abide and continue with you through all your brethren and the joy of faith.
Yeah. He's confident that what God is doing in him and even without him will continue, right? There is a sense that even if he's not around to help, that God is really in charge, right? Sometimes I think I want to micromanage things a little bit. Let's do this my way. I'm pretty sure I know the way this ought to turn out. But he's confident that the work that God has begun, that God will complete with or without him. And so there's this sense of God being truly in charge, and God having the goodness to do it right and the power to make it happen. And that idea that even things that are evil or damaging, and he's not minimizing the reality of suffering there, but God is powerful enough to make things that are truly bad work out for good in the end, right? That the suffering they undergo will somehow work into God's good plan. You have to believe there that there's someone with a plan and someone with the power to carry it out, and that the plan is good, to think that all of that is going to come together. And the last thing I see there is when he talks about to suffer on behalf of Christ. He's saying that with the understanding that Christ himself suffers with us. When Paul met Jesus on the road to Damascus, and he was still Saul and he was still persecuting the church, Jesus said, "Why do you persecute me?" Well, Jesus was in heaven at the right hand of God. So, when he says me, he's talking about his people. He's talking about the church. He's talking about us. And so when we suffer in some way, Christ is alongside us, with us in that, suffering with us. And so Paul has a confidence that we're not alone in that. Jesus participates with us in our suffering. I told you last week that this whole book kind of revolves around the Christ hymn at the beginning of chapter 2. And that is what this section points to, and that's what we're going to study next week. So read Philippians 2, 1 through 11 for next week, and we will see kind of the heart of the book. All this points forward to it, and then everything after it kind of draws out of it and gives examples from it. So that'll be next week's lesson. Thank you, everybody. Thank you for coming. Thank you for the great discussion. And I'd love to take a volunteer for prayers and prayer requests if you want to do that now.
Suffering was granted so 29, my version says, "For it has been granted to you that for the sake of Christ, you should not only believe in him, but also suffer his sake." Why do you think he uses the word granted? Like it's a gift?
Yeah. And it's charizomai. So it's from the same word for grace. That, we talked about that, the greeting being like charis, grace, that gift. And I think he means to say that it is a gift. I think that's hard to understand for us, and maybe for them too. Yeah. What do you think?
People? I don't know. I was talking with, I have a friend who has had like 18 surgeries, and her recent surgery was pretty painful, and it took her a long time to recover. And she and I had talked about this idea of being granted the gift of suffering, and how it's hard to think about and hard to take, but that she also could feel in ways that were hard to describe, could feel a closeness to Christ and in sharing in that suffering. Not that her heart surgery is sharing, via persecution in any way. She just has a lot of health problems. But it was an interesting discussion, and she's like, I don't know how to explain it or articulate it, but it's just like there's something there that I don't understand, that it's meaningful. I don't know what it is, but it is something there somehow, that suffering can bring us closer to God.
Yeah, and I notice that when we come in from the outside and say to the person, and speak to the person who's suffering, it just needs to be lament, right? It needs to be coming alongside and saying, how long, oh Lord? We cry with them. But when the person speaks out of their own suffering, then you hear the wisdom, right? Mm-hmm. Paul speaks from his own position of being in chains about the gift of suffering, right? We can never put it on someone, but we see the beauty that it produces in the person as they recognize it themselves. What are y'all's thoughts on that?
I think maybe that it's, becomes a gift when you're suffering, but yet you feel that closeness to Christ because he's always there. He's not going anywhere. So you can share in that comfort. He brings the peace, knowing that you're not alone, whether you're suffering with him, for him, or, just health issues like that. You have that comfort of Christ always being with you.
Everybody froze.
I think when I've had times of hardship or times of suffering,
I think you're hogging the bandwidth.
And I get in a funk, and I'm like, I don't even know what to pray for anymore, and I'm just kind of struggling. When I think about sermon and passages, and God has only good things intended for you, and he's planned out your life, and it just kind of takes the burden off of me of thinking, how do I fix this? What do I do? How do I go on? And then what do I pray for? And then I just know that I don't have to suffer, I don't have to be alone, and that even though I don't see it now, something good will come of this. Even if it's a year in the future, which is longer than I want it to be, it just kind of puts me at peace to go, oh, okay, I can step back, and I know that I don't have to plan this out. I can let it run its course, and that I think brings me closer to God, because it gives me kind of a sense of peace. And it's always been in the past, in retrospect, when I've looked back and gone, oh, that was really hard, but it brought me to this. So that I think, when I think of being granted suffering, it's like it stinks, but when you're in it, but it does bring you peace. It can bring you peace, I should say.
Yeah. Well, and sometimes, it's when I still feel like I have things that I can do to fix it, then I'm still trying to do them to fix it, right? It's not until I run out of things that I have an ability to just rest in that trust in the Lord. And it's because there's no other options before me.
Yeah, that's how I most relate to it. Because when you're down at the bottom, you've basically, once you fully relinquish complete control. And my favorite passage I come back to consistently is Psalm 46:10. Be still and know that I am God. I will be exalted among all nations. I will be exalted on the earth. And so in me, when things just get completely overwhelming and I know I have no control, I'm like, just be still and know that I am God. Just be still. And you kind of like, I lay it all at your feet. And I think that's in my stress and anxiety, but I feel like there's, from having not been through the type of suffering you're talking about, from a health perspective, but it's she has no control over her health issues probably. And so she just has to, when you relinquish that, I think there's a sense of closeness you develop.
But it's as hard when someone you love is in
health
struggles, right? And so you've lived through that.
Yeah. No, it would break my heart when my mom was said, I'm ready to go home to Jesus. I'm like, no, but I'm not ready for you to go. She's like, I know you're not ready. I'm ready. Tomorrow. It was like, Paul, I'm there. If I close my eyes tonight and I get to see Jesus, oh my gosh, that's the best thing ever. So it's a hard balance.
And you said, no, Paul said, I know I will remain for you.
But she was like, I know. She was like, I know. But if I go to sleep and I see Jesus, I'm very happy about that. So she was very content in her place when she passed. So, yeah.
One of our pastors, our former pastor's mother had Jesus, and he always said that that's not the path to Jesus he would have chosen for her, but it's the one she has.
Yeah.
And we have to praise God that that's how she's getting to Jesus, because there's nothing else to do.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's one of the last things that my dad said was he was just ready to go see Jesus. He was ready to go home.
Yep, my mom too.
Was tired. But we said, but no, Dad, you can't. But he passed away February a year ago, and he went to the bathroom and just fell backwards, and he died before he hit the ground. And the doctors and the caregiver that had gone to see Mom and Dad in their apartment, their senior citizen appointment, said that if he did live longer, that he was going to have to suffer a big time and be on morphine, and he would not have wanted that.
Yeah.
We have all of each I really do think each individual story is a way of being with Christ, right? So like, even if it's not persecution, right? Even if it's the health, like none of us get out alive, right? We all end up with some kind of health or something, right? At the end of life. And yet it's still all brings us closer to God. And we know that there is a point to go to where there are no more tears or dying or death, and God himself is our light. That confidence that there is something at the end that makes sense, and that makes everything, everything is redeemed and remade and holy. It's good news.
Mm-hmm. Sorry I was late. I was accidentally on last week's lesson.
Oh, it's the same link, but
yeah, no, I thought to myself, wow, everyone's wearing the same clothes.
Yeah.
Then I thought
that could happen. I might wear the same clothes every 3 days. It's possible.
And then Erin had the same clothes on, and she was outside. And this week she's inside, and she's got some different clothes on.
You look very fancy in your earrings. They look good. Well, thank you, everybody. You stay around and chat if you want, but I'll just say thanks. And it looks like Laura Kate made another awesome drawing. Thank you very much. I really like that.
Yeah. Bye, everyone.
I'm jealous. I can't see the drawing.
Hey. She just sent it to me. I'll post it.
Okay, thank you.